The Bible and Education. This is our second installment of this Friday night series. We're going to be doing them every Friday night at 7:30 p.m. That's Central Standard Time. All of the websites where this is broadcasting, you can catch it on those. We're going to be talking today about the second half of Genesis. That's Genesis 23 to 50. And right now, what I'm going to do is send an invite to a bunch of the best minds in education and in the Bible so that they can join us. There's a lot to talk about. One of the things that we discussed most recently when we had our discussion last week was the fact that we don't often read the Bible as teachers. Often we read the Bible, we might read it and try to figure out ways to teach the Bible. But the Bible has a message that is important specifically for those who are educated. And it is important that we have some time to think about what exactly educators are supposed to take from every single part of the Bible, from every single part of the counsel of God. All of that matters, and all of that is important. So I'm going to talk today about Genesis 23 to 50. And if you are in one of the rooms where you can chat, feel free to add a comment. I'd love to be able to hear and to respond to what people are thinking about. And we had a great discussion last week about Genesis 1 through 22. We talked about several different points. For Genesis 23 to 50, this is largely after the sacrifice of Isaac. It tells the story of Jacob and Jacob's children. Joseph obviously has a huge role in this part of the Bible. When I think about this, it's important because Genesis is so much about families, and it's so much about fathers and their children learning from them. And so there's a lot of different parts of the second part of Genesis that I think are important to think about when we're approaching life as educators, when we're trying to figure out how to introduce young people to every single subject. It's not just about teaching the Bible, it's also about teaching science, literature, art, teaching mathematics. All of those things are things that reflect upon the power, the dignity, the sovereignty of God. So let's just jump right into this right now. When we look at Genesis 23, after the sacrifice of Isaac, which we talked about last week, and which is very complex from the perspective of an educator, because there's obviously the horror factor of somebody being asked to sacrifice their child by God. We talked about all of the different interpretations of that last week. But after that event, we find now there is a part that deals with Sarah is buried just after the sacrifice of Isaac. In some people I know who follow the Orthodox Jewish faith, they say that there are rabbinical texts that claim that Sarah died because she was so horrified about the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. That's not something that I would necessarily follow. But what ends up happening is that Abraham now, he had two sons. He had to cast one out, Ishmael. He has the son that is the son of the promise, Isaac, and he has to build his legacy. So he has to build his dynasty. He has to take what has been left to him, because God did provide a sacrifice so that Isaac didn't have to be sacrificed. And one of the things that we see is that the families are very concerned about finding wives for their children. And so they confer with each other about the best way to marry in order for the children to prosper later on. Now, we get to the generation of Jacob, and there are several important parts about Jacob. Jacob is the one who wrestles with the angel and who sees the stairway to heaven. Jacob, of course, is the direct father of the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. So he has a very special place in Genesis. And I want to take a look at some of these distinct parts here that deal with Jacob, and specifically Jacob wrestling with the angel, which is something that I think is significant. Let me get to that part, because I think that this represents a lot of what it is when we grow, when we try to contend with the full meaning of God, all of the things of God's creation that are there. Let me just find the part about him wrestling with the angel. It says in Genesis 32:24, we have this part that says this: Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he said. "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he answered, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. Then Jacob named the place Peniel, "For I have seen God face to face," he said, "and I have been delivered." The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. That is why to this day the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle that is at the hip socket, because he struck Jacob's hip socket at the thigh muscle. Now, you may ask, what does that have to do with being a teacher? Why would a teacher have a particular interpretation of that? Well, it means a lot to me because this passage of the Bible is about struggle. It's the fact that Jacob has to struggle with God in order to really see what God's purpose is for him, in order for him to be led to his mission, to the God-appointed calling that is going to fill his life. It's not something that is easy. Enlightenment, knowledge, education is not something that is without moments of struggle, moments of difficulty, moments of contention. All of that is part of the educational process, and it's part of how God leads us and has people in our lives who bring us to be the greatest that we can possibly be. There are a lot of educators who don't understand this sometimes, and I think that they struggle because their students are not struggling. That is to say, they don't want that moment where a student resists you or a student fights you. They think that there is something that's going to be very pleasant about education. You can just sort of lead people to the right idea, or you can lead them to knowledge. But if you are really educating your children or your students so that they know what God wants for them, not necessarily what you want for them, because it's really about what God is calling them to, then you have to prepare them to wrestle. You have to coach them to deal with resistance. You have to coach them to deal with mistakes. Jacob, obviously, even though the Lord says to him, "You have prevailed," in reality, of course, he broke his hip socket. So, he has a war wound that comes from his wrestling with God. I think all of those are important things to consider when we think about ourselves as educators. Are we willing to let our students struggle, to let our children struggle? We can train them to be good wrestlers. And I don't think wrestling only is a physical thing. I think wrestling is also very much a mental and academic pursuit. But we can't fight their battles for them. We can't, I can't write my students' papers. I can't take my students' tests for me. I have to prepare them for the moment that they're going to be wrestling with the forces out there in the world. And remember that everything in the world was created by God. So whenever we are wrestling with the world, we are wrestling to a certain degree with God. But it's all towards the purpose of trying to find the proper calling for him. Teachers deal with that struggle, with the agonistic, that's the Greek term for it, the agonistic part of education, in different ways. I think some teachers, they try to gently coax students and they nurture them when they are confronting failure or they're confronting hardship. Others may take a different tone and they get stern with their students to try to prepare them because they know what's waiting out there for them. I think that the Bible, at least that passage in my mind, doesn't tell us that as teachers or parents that there's a specific route that all of us have to follow. Ultimately, what really has to happen is the child has to wrestle with God in order to reach their true potential. And so there are different ways that we ourselves in particular are called to teach students. Some of us are disciplinarians, and that means that when we have a problem with the student, we give them the drill sergeant speech, do you want to be a failure in life? Get up and pick yourself up and stop crying, right? Others of us are gentler maybe, and more preparing them emotionally, maybe to tell them, look, there's going to be moments when it's going to be really, really hard, but you have to look always to the end. You always have to look to the final part, and be ready for it. I think that every subject that we teach students has some element in it, some aspect of a tool or of a weapon that the student's going to need to contend with the world outside. You have to know history, you have to know math, you have to know English, you have to know culture, all of these different science. And so when people are in our care and we're educating them, everything that we don't teach them is one tool or one weapon that we deprive them of. And so the moment that they have to wrestle with God, that they have to wrestle with their struggles in life, that's one more thing that they don't have to be able to prevail in the way that Jacob prevailed when he wrestled with God. Jacob was not, from what we can tell, he didn't go through a very rigorous academic study. That's not really the point in the time and place where he lived. He was being raised by patriarchs that had been handpicked by God. But for us, it's different. We do have a role in preparing students for struggle. And it's some of the hardest moments I think I've had as an educator are when the student is struggling. Because when the student is struggling, very often when their academics are suffering, their behavior also suffers. They're frustrated with the fact that they don't know the material. So these are the same students who are often going to be coming late to class or missing class, skipping class, going to be asking for extensions. And often when you have all of those problems being concentrated on the same student, you can predict that there's a good chance that that student is going to blame you. That as all of that behavior compounds itself, that no matter how nice you are, at some point, the student is also going to be object to you. They're going to feel like you did something wrong, especially if you confront them. This is one of the things that I've had to deal with parents sometimes. When a parent says, I want you to call me the minute that there's a disciplinary problem with my child, right? It's important that the parent understands in a clear sense that a child who has been confronted about problems with his behavior is a child who is probably going to lash out. They're going to follow their instinct, which is usually the first thing that a child does when they have been disciplined, is they're going to want to create some diversion to get the attention away from themselves onto the teacher. Now, I've just been joined by Max Lyon. Hello, Max. Are you on the line?
Hey, Bobby, how you doing? I'm here.
I'm great. How are you doing? Yeah, I'm great. Can you hear me?
Good. I can.
Oh, great,
yes.
great.
Glad
Well,
to connect.
great. Well, I hope the connection is good. I'm just gonna draw you in because I've been talking for 13 minutes straight, so my tongue's kind of tired. But that's the life of a teacher, right?
Yes.
One of the things, right now I'm talking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, which I know might not seem like a particularly educational passage, but it has a lot of educational meaning for me because I think that you have to prepare students, you have to prepare your children for that moment of wrestling with God. God put us all in a role where to reach our full potential, we have to wrestle, we have to struggle and stuff. And so I think that teachers have to put a lot of thought into what is the biblical response when you're trying to get a student ready to struggle with something hard, something that's going to be painful. And the student sometimes lashes out at you. How do you deal with that to motivate them with disappointment, motivate them when they have just faced discipline? and it's a tough thing, but I think most teachers have to deal with that. What do you see your role as when you have a student and you know that that student is going to have to really contend with a lot of difficulties out there in the world? What is the proper way for you to prepare them for it? Do you tell them how hard the world is at the beginning? Do you slowly let them know how hard it is? What would be the best way that you approached it as a father and as a teacher?
Are you asking me, Bobby?
Yeah, sure. I
Bobby,
think
our connection is not so good.
oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll keep you on in case the connection goes good. You can just jump in whenever you want, okay?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, so and I not only have the connection problem, my phone is losing power. It's not because I'm not enjoying this or want to be here. But
Mhm.
to answer your question, I think this is one of the most challenging things that teachers face, and people go into the teaching profession not realizing that discipline, which interestingly, the root of that word discipline is disciple. So
Right.
we're really involved in discipleship when we're disciplining our students. And I don't think a lot of us as teachers, we don't sign up for that. So
Yeah.
you know, we love teaching and researching and writing and doing
Hmm.
lesson plans and knowledge and all that. And as Christian teachers, we love the Bible and want to see how God is in every subject and all these things. But man, the discipline thing is difficult. Um, just a little personal anecdote. I almost washed out my first year. They say a lot of teachers don't last but a couple of years because of discipline, and that was almost me. If I didn't have a principal that believed in me, I would have gotten fired because I wasn't doing a real good job at the discipling part of it. Um, so I don't I don't purport to have a lot of answers. There's kind of not a lot of pat answers here because it really a lot of it is individual. It's
Right.
that principle of individuality. So every situation can literally be quite different. But
Yeah. I always I try to think of this passage about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and I try to remind myself that the child's overall life struggle is going to be with God. He's going to be wrestling with God, not with me. So I'm preparing him for that. So I don't necessarily need to be the one that he's locked in this, tough struggle with. He's going to be having to deal with what God calls him to. But I do have to prepare him for that. So I can't. In the letter from Hebrews, it says a father doesn't love his child if he doesn't discipline him. I think the same thing goes for a teacher. You have to discipline your student.
absolutely, that
Yeah.
you that balance of discipline and of love and and finding that balance is difficult as a parent and difficult as a teacher. In the very real sense, it is like very much like parenting. I mean, you're disciplining that child in the absence of the parent, and in
Hmm.
some ways it makes your job is even harder because you don't have the authority and respect and and as a parent would, because you don't stand in the same relationship to the child as a parent does.
Well,
So
it
it,
seems to
it's
me that if
tough.
you're in a Christian, wait, what'd you say?
It's a tough it's a tough situation. It's a important part of the job, but we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is.
Right. Yeah, I think that one of the things I've realized is if you're in a Christian education environment, it is important to have an agreement with the parents that's clear in this area. There are parents who I think don't want you to touch upon ethical issues or life issues that would be replacing them as parents. But I think it's important to have an agreement with the parents so that you both know what the boundaries are and what limits they have to observe. One of the things I think that's important is that one of the worst things a parent can do in a Christian education context is to have a very strong disagreement with the teacher in front of the student. That's
right.
something that I think parents sometimes they don't realize how damaging that is to the relationship, because as that child is wrestling, as that student is struggling with the discipline issue and with the academics and everything, you've just communicated to the student that, if they are having a discipline problem, that they can deflect it onto the teacher by telling the parent that the teacher did something, and they'll model that exactly on what they heard. Whatever the concern was from the teacher, students are perceptive. They hear it, and they will very often sort of frame what they're telling the parents in order to get the parent angry at the teacher rather than angry at them. So it's a very delicate thing. I think parents have to respect that. Don't you? Do you feel that way?
Absolutely. I've told parents and I've taught that what we should do is, if we disagree, we need to disagree in private. And when
Right.
we speak to the child, to speak with one voice.
Hmm.
It's analogous to a parent, a mother and a father disagreeing in front of a child and not being in unity. It's it's
Hmm.
it's very it can be very damaging to the
Right.
child. Um, it undermines the authority of the
Hmm.
teacher. Um,
Yeah, and then I think what ends up happening is, again, instead of wrestling with all of the great knowledge that's out there in this world that God created, and instead of doing that in order to try to reach their potential and find out what God has designed for them, instead they're wrestling with either their parent or the teacher, and they're doing it in this sort of mentally divisive way where they're just trying to turn people against each other. So I think that that's a part of it that is very tricky. Now, another part of Genesis, the second half of Genesis, that I thought was very interesting as a teacher, for those of you who teach history, of course, this is a really key one, is the moment when Joseph is reunited with his brothers. And remember that his brothers threw him down a well and they sold him into slavery. And they don't know that it is their brother that they are going to meet when they go to Egypt during the famine, because unbeknownst to them, Joseph has risen up. And so he's one of the most powerful men in Egypt, and he has the power to be able to give them grain to survive. So when the brothers come and they realize that it's Joseph who saved them, Joseph gives that very providential line where he says, "It was for God's good that evil was done." Or let me find the exact phrasing of it. You know what I'm talking about, right, Max?
yes, I've always quoted that. I don't have the exact wording, but God meant it for evil. I mean, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to save many.
Yes,
Something
yes. Let me
a rough
find.
paraphrase.
Yeah, it's it's the return to Egypt. I want to get the exact wording. Ultimately, what he says is that what you did for evil, God used for good, so that he could save many. Now, this is key for the providential understanding of history. And I think it's a text that's important for history teachers to keep in mind when they are trying to lay out the very complex historical events that have happened for students. Students often really do have difficulty with their faith, asking, why would God allow the Holocaust to happen? Why would God allow slavery to happen? Why would God allow tragedies to happen, or even the persecution of Israel? And it's tough because, on the one hand, Joseph is not saying that it was right for his brothers to sell him into slavery. Remember that Joseph goes through this period of activities with his brothers where he kind of, I wouldn't say toys with them, but he draws out the moment that he reveals himself to them to kind of make them feel uncomfortable, right? He plays that trick where he hides things in their bags so that they think that they're going to be accused of having stolen something. And he does all of that because he can't just leave it unaddressed, the fact that they did in fact betray him in that way. He does make them uncomfortable. I don't think he's saying that that it was right for them to sell him into slavery, but rather, and Max has to run. But thank you so much for joining me, Max, and
Sure
we'll
thing.
catch up soon. Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. It's important to be able to frame that in a way that students understand that he's not justifying all of the evil things that are done in the world, even things that are done sometimes in the name of Christ or in the name of some I don't know, greater good that people are using hypocritically as a pretext to do things. But it is a testament to the power of God that even things that are evil, even things that are wicked and horrible, do sometimes lead to things that carry out God's plan. So I think that Joseph's reading of Providence is significant, and it's useful for us as educators, because at least it gives us a text for us to try to lay out how we want to present those historical problems to students. And particularly the historical problem being the fact that if God is in control of everything, why do so many bad things happen? I know, for instance, that there's a lot of discussion about colonialism among educators. How do you present colonialism? How do you present things that may have been racially offensive or racially oppressive to students in a way that makes sense to them, that does honor to the fact that people have done wicked things in the past, but that then also still points them to the fact that God can use anything. He can use any kind of suffering for good. Now, one of the things along these lines which really depressed me was the fact that I was speaking to a teacher recently who said that they removed Phyllis Wheatley from their syllabus where she was teaching in elementary school because of the fact that they it seemed to this teacher that Phyllis Wheatley was too Christian, even though she was the first African-American poet. And that's unfortunate because the very first African-American poet, Phyllis Wheatley, she was deeply Christian. She wrote a lot about Christianity. I don't think that that was just a cynical ploy to get published, or that she was just invoking those things in order to hold sway over her white audience. I think she really did have faith in Jesus Christ, and she believed in it. And she did write a poem about how, despite all of the things that she had gone through, that she was glad that she was able to see Christ. Now, that is a hard text to teach to people, because if you do it in a clumsy way, you could end up telling them that it was a good thing that she was sold into slavery at the age of 7 and brought to Massachusetts as a slave. And so that's tricky. But if there's a way that you can read the poems and instead just remark upon yourself that with all of the evil that men do, God is still able to find some good in it, that not find good in what the men did, but rather that God is able to use even evil things in order to bring about good, then I think that it's a worthwhile exercise in history. And speaking of history, okay, the last of the passages that I want to look at in the second half of Genesis is the part where Joseph gives the instructions just before, Joseph gives his instructions upon his death, right at the end. Now, Jacob, as he's dying, he makes these statements to each of his 12 sons, and that's all interesting. But the part that I thought was very interesting from a teacher's perspective is what Joseph says in the very last lines of Genesis. It says, Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation. The son of Manasseh, son Machir, were recognized by Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land that he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. As Joseph is dying, he reminds everyone about the miracles that God had carried out to those generations of patriarchs. And he says, he doesn't know when in the future, but at any point in the future, when they leave Egypt, they have to carry Joseph's bones out of there. That's not really where Joseph was meant to be buried and where he was meant to be laid to rest. It's a beautiful statement on what it is that we owe our ancestors. And that is always something that we touch upon when we are teaching the fields of history and literature, that there are things that were so important, that there were missions that people carried out, there were callings that people felt dedicated to, that they couldn't carry all the way to completion. They were struggling to finish it, but they did care so much about that, and that was why they contributed the things that they did to the civilizations that they were part of. It would be wrong to leave Joseph's bones in Egypt, even if it was 800 or 8,000 years into the future, because he was someone who lived and he influenced the people who came afterward. And it was his mind that he did not want to be laid to rest in Egypt. He wanted to be laid to rest where he was home. Whenever we study history and we get into the more moral questions of who were great men or who were men that we admire, who were the heroes of history, we always have to keep in mind, what did they consider the home place that they wanted to be laid to rest in? And when we study history, we're not just passively studying it. We are, in a sense, carrying out the last wishes of those people. These were real people who lived, and what they cared about mattered. These are real people who wrote books, and what the writers actually thought, I think it matters. That's a big part of education that I think that as Christian teachers we have to keep track of. I want to thank you for joining me for this, and I will be back again next week, and we're going to be dealing with Exodus. So there's going to be a lot of exciting stuff to talk about there.